the Reasonable Doubts podcast. And today we just kind of want to have a very informal discussion about evidence and how we want to think about evidence in terms of theism and naturalism, and how all those interesting concepts interplay. I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how evidence actually, or what evidence actually is, and how it does actually support different hypotheses. And so I thought it'd be cool to have Jeff Lowder on to have that discussion with us. And also joining us is my friend Brandon, whose name I don't know because I'm only friends with him on the internet. Is it Mozak? Is that your last name?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, see, I've never known that. and then I have Daniel Linford here as well.
How's it going?
Now, how do you guys want to start this off? So, I guess we could start off by asking, what is evidence, actually? So maybe that's who wants to take that question? Like, what, in the broadest sense, what do we mean by evidence?
I always thought it was just basically any observation you would expect to see given X being a certain propositional statement.
So I think that works if you take a certain kind of view about what evidence is, but if you want to give a definition of evidence in general, I think what we need to do is to do something more broad than what it would end up being in a particular theory, or else that theory would end up begging the question. So I think that broadly construed, what we mean by evidence is that evidence is a reason to believe something, that a reason to believe a proposition that doesn't just simply deductively entail the proposition. That it has the relationship between the proposition that it gives justification for in itself is of some other nature, some non-deductive nature. So for instance, under some views, it might be that the probability of the proposition being true is raised by the evidence. That seems to be a view that a lot of people would have.
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm unaware of any significantly different views. I've always kind of seen it as, some observation counts as evidence for some hypothesis, if and only if it makes that hypothesis more probable than it would have been without that piece of evidence, without that observation.
Well, right. Well, so some people, so at least there's been some some positions in the history of philosophy where they've denied that you can have that's the right way to look at things. But I think you are right that the most people would see evidence as being something like this probabilistic thing, where it doesn't necessarily have to be Bayesian, but that it has some kind of relationship in terms of the probability that's conferred on the conclusion.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know, Jeff. What are your thoughts on this, broadly speaking?
So I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to attempt to put a book in front of the camera.
Okay.
There is, oddly enough, a book called, you ready for this? The Book of Evidence.
All right.
By a philosopher at Johns Hopkins University, Peter Achenstein. I'm not actually sure how to say his last name, but it was published by Oxford University Press, and was recommended to me by Greg Cavan, a philosopher who specializes in inductive logic and the study of evidence. Okay. And that book actually talks about 4 alternative definitions of evidence, which are probably too obscure to just read into the camera. They're highly technical, and they're the kind of thing you have to read and read again about 15 times to understand. But there are apparently, I shouldn't say apparently, but it's not just that there's more than one view of evidence. There's at least 4 significant views on what constitutes evidence, and the differences between these views have nothing to do with the different theories of probability or Bayesianism or anything like that. These different views on evidence appear to completely sidestep those controversies and add yet an entirely another layer or dimension to the equation in terms of different points of view on what constitutes evidence. Definitely one of them talks about the increase of probability. The fancy name for it is the positive relevance definition of evidence. There's another one that says, these are the 2 easy ones to define. There's another one that says that something is evidence if and only if it makes the hypothesis probable, i.e. its probability is greater than 1/2.
Oh, okay.
And these 2 approaches that I just described correspond to what Richard Swinburne calls C-inductive and P-inductive arguments.
Right, right.
There are other kinds of evidence, though, that Ackenstein lists out in his book. In fact, I'm looking at my notes here. Let's see. In his terminology, he calls them potential evidence, veridical evidence, ES evidence, where ES stands for epistemic situation, and then subjective evidence. But the distinctions between some of these are so highly technical that I'm not going to go into it.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So all of us here are kind of interested in the theism, naturalism debates, and how where the evidence falls on those issues. And there's a lot of people, I think, in the more popular atheist movement that say that there is no evidence for theism at all. And I think that this kind of rests on a misunderstanding of what evidence is, and I guess what I mean by that is that probably, at least I would bet that given all of those 4 different types of evidences, that their claim would still be false, given this what I would be claiming here, that there clearly is some evidence for theism, even if it's relatively weak evidence. Go ahead, Brandon.
Oh no, I was curious. I mean, maybe I heard wrong, but was one of the definitions you gave, Lowder, that it only counts as evidence if and only if it made it more probable, as in it had to contribute to it being like 51% or greater? I mean, wouldn't that?
Yeah,
well, I mean, wouldn't under
yeah.
that definition, if one viewed theism as less than that, then there would be no evidence for theism?
Yeah, no, I guess you're right on that one.
Yeah, so this is why it's so crucial to for anyone who was a philosopher, is a wannabe philosopher or an aspiring philosopher who uses the word evidence, really has to define what they mean. And to his credit, Richard Swinburne does this very explicitly and methodically, and I really respect him for not just for attempting to do that, but for what he has to say in general. I mean, the man clearly knows his confirmation theory. If you use the definition of evidence that it's merely an increase in probability, the positive relevance definition of evidence, then I don't know of any in-principle argument or a priori argument to show that there's no evidence for theism. So then you'd have to come up with an empirical or a posteriori argument to show that there's no evidence for theism. And I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to work.
Right.
I guess the key point, the most important thing to take away from this is this point. On the increase in probability definition of evidence, that's a very low bar for what it means for something to be evidence. It's such a low bar that you can say there are 10 pieces of evidence, E1, E2, all the way up to E10. You could say that E1 through E9 favor H1, E10 favors H2, and the total evidence, when you weigh E1 through E9 against E2, it outweighs it, so the total evidence favors H1. This seems obvious when you say it in the abstract like this, but then when you actually apply it to theism versus naturalism, everybody seems to forget the obvious. And so, and I think it's partially because they're not analyzing it formally. I think it's partially because of the partisanship that seems to exist on both sides. The assumption seems to be that if you are an atheist, that a priori that must mean that you believe there's no evidence for God's existence. Even if you define atheism as the positive belief that there is no God, so-called Gnostic atheism, or conversely, if you're a theist, then the assumption seems to be that you must believe there's no evidence for atheism in the strong sense. All of the available evidence favors theism over atheism. And that's just silly. I can believe in X on the basis of E1 through E9 while admitting that there's some tiny piece of evidence, E10, that favors hypothesis Y, a hypothesis that's incompatible with X.
Right.
And that's just, I would call that logic 101. And yesterday, Justin and I had an interesting Twitter debate with someone who I'm not going to name, but you could easily find it on Twitter. And he seemed to be one of those people who assumes that if you're an atheist, then you can't believe that there's any evidence at all for theism. And that doesn't follow from the concept of atheism, even on a strong definition. It certainly doesn't follow from any of the definitions of evidence that I'm familiar with. In my opinion, and this is just an opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but in my opinion, that just reflects a highly partisan individual. You know, I am not someone who aspires to be an apologist for atheism. I am not the counterpart to Richard Swinburne as a natural theologian. I am not a natural atheologian. So I'm not trying to spin, you know, the facts here. If I think that a piece of evidence E10 favors theism while E1 through E9 favor naturalism, I have no problem whatsoever with calling it like I see it and saying that E10 favors theism, and I can do that consistent with my belief that the total evidence strongly favors naturalism over theism. There's absolutely no contradiction there.
Right. One of the more interesting arguments that can be found in some of Draper's work, and that you kind of led me to, was this argument from moral agency, which I find to be a really interesting argument. Essentially, well, I guess there's different ways that one could kind of unpack this argument depending on, you know, what you would believe about, you know, libertarian concepts of free will, or, you know, various things like that. But could you kind of give an unpacking of that argument?
Yeah, so the argument for moral agency, to put sort of a snarky spin on it, you could say that the fine-tuning argument sucks, and the argument for moral agency does what the fine-tuning argument wants to do but is incapable of doing. The fine-tuning argument doesn't work because it seizes on one feature of the universe, the fact that you know, the laws of physics and the particular values of the natural constants and maybe the initial conditions are such that they allow life. And it seizes on that feature doesn't even address any other features of those laws of physics, and says, you know, wow, look at that. Isn't that amazing? That favors theism over naturalism. But in order for a theistic explanation to work, a theistic explanation is a specialized version of a more general class of explanation called a personal explanation. When you explain something in terms of a person, you have to be able to say how the person did the thing that you're explaining, and you also have to say why they did it. They obviously had a reason or a goal. That's the whole point in positing a personal explanation as opposed to an impersonal or mechanistic explanation. So a theistic explanation for fine-tuning is really, I guess at best, it's incomplete, because it doesn't tell us how God fine-tuned the universe, and more important, it doesn't tell us why God fine-tuned the universe. And to put that last point a different way, we can ask the skeptical question, why should we expect God to fine-tune the universe for the evolution of intelligent life?
Right.
Why not fine-tuning the universe for just bacterial life, and that's it, with no further evolution? Or, you know, why not fine-tune it for quasars, and that's it? You know, what is so special about life? And the fine-tuning argument, the way it's traditionally presented, just stops there. It doesn't have an answer to that question. The argument for moral agency is related to the fine-tuning argument because it does appeal to facts about the physical laws, initial conditions, and constants, but that isn't really the focus. The focus is on the fact that there are moral agents in the universe. It's a lot easier to answer the question, why would God want moral agents to exist, than it is to answer the question, why would God fine-tune the laws of physics so that intelligent life could evolve. A moral agent you can define as a being that has moral duties to others, and that is, at least in some cases, a being that is morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy for succeeding or failing to perform those moral duties. So that's the definition of a moral agent. Now, what does moral agency have to do with theism? Why is moral agency evidence favoring theism over naturalism? Well, a morally perfect God might create, in fact, you could actually start off sort of skeptically and say, okay, you can make a distinction between moral agents and moral patients. A moral patient is someone who can be the beneficiary of an obligation, but doesn't have any moral obligations of its own. For example, severely mentally disabled people, infants, sentient animals are moral patients. They can be the beneficiary of an obligation, even though we would not say that they have any obligations of their own, whereas normally, cognitively functioning, not intellectually disabled adult humans, we would say are moral agents. They can have moral obligations. So you could ask the question, why would a morally perfect God create moral agents instead of just moral patients? Or why would God create moral agents that are embodied rather than just creating a bunch of ghosts, spirits, or souls?
Right.
So with that sort of skeptical introduction, Paul Draper says that there are reasons on the assumption that theism is true that don't apply on the assumption that naturalism is true to expect the existence of moral agents. Moral agents have a distinctive sort of dignity or worth. Moral agency requires moral responsibility. Moral responsibility requires libertarian free will, which is more likely on the assumption that theism is true than on the assumption that naturalism is true. Of course, given the fact that there are moral agents, the fact that they are embodied is more probable on naturalism than on theism, but according to Draper, not much more probable. The fine-tuning data comes into play here because the fine-tuning data greatly strengthens this argument by showing that moral agency is extremely improbable on naturalism. And this is because if naturalism is true, then the only way that you could have a moral agent is to have an embodied moral agent. Naturalism rules out, by definition, the possibility of spirits, souls, ghosts, and other unembodied or disembodied minds. So the only way you could even have a moral agent is to have an embodied moral agent, and that's why the fine-tuning data strengthens the argument for moral agency, but that's not all that the argument for moral agency has to say. So the formal structure of the argument for moral agency goes like this. Premise 1, E, the evidence to be explained is known to be true, and the evidence to be explained is the fact that moral agents exist. Premise 2, the probability of E conditional upon theism is very much greater, not just greater, but very much greater than the probability of E conditional upon naturalism. Premise 3, naturalism is not intrinsically much more probable than theism, and therefore premise 4, other evidence held equal, theism is more probable than naturalism. So this is a prima facie argument for theism, not an ultima facie argument for theism. It says everything else held equal, this one piece of evidence favors theism over naturalism. It's not an ultima facie argument that says all things considered,
right.
The total evidence shows that theism is more probable than naturalism. I think this is a very interesting argument. I think it would be uncontroversial to say that it's much stronger than the traditional fine-tuning argument. Probably even our Twitter debate opponent yesterday could admit that much. And so the only question is the conclusion true? Is it true that other evidence held equal, this piece of evidence shows that theism is more probable than naturalism? I'm inclined to agree with that. I have not studied the topic of libertarian free will at all, so I don't really have philosophical intuitions about that. Some people in the movement are really into that. I know if you go to Tom Clark's website, the Center for Naturalism, a big part of his website is showing that free will doesn't exist, and I simply don't have an opinion on that. I don't even have an intuition. I don't know if I think libertarian free will is true, or if I would be a compatibilist if I'd studied it more. But with that as it said, I don't see an obvious reason to reject Draper's point that libertarian free will is more likely on theism than it is on naturalism.
I think that's right.
It certainly seems right to me. So anyway, when we debated this yesterday, it came up, sort of go full circle. This argument came up because our Twitter debate opponent was saying that theism is BS, and he has no problem with sort of an in-your-face approach saying that theism is BS. And I said, well, I'm an atheist, but I don't think theism is BS. Not in the sense that I think he was using the word, the phrase BS.
Sure.
If calling something BS simply means that it's false, well then, okay, then I would say that theism is false. But if it means what it connotates, which is that it's it's something that you would have to be irrational to believe, it's obviously false, something along those lines, then I don't think it's BS. I can see why someone could find the argument for moral agency much more impressive than I find it, and say that it's so much more impressive that it outweighs sort of Draperian arguments for naturalism that I use. I would disagree with that person, but I think a fully informed person could arrive at that conclusion. So I don't think it's BS. I don't think you have to be stupid or a moron or scientifically illiterate to be a theist. I probably would say that about young Earth creationism, but I'm not willing to say that about mere theism.
Right.
And I'm trying to remember what his objections to the argument as such were. One of his objections had to do with the claim that naturalism is not intrinsically much more probable than theism. He made the claim that naturalism has such a high intrinsic probability it's virtually 1. And I think that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
I don't remember that.
There are 3 fundamental metaphysical hypotheses. There's metaphysical naturalism, there's supernaturalism, and then a catch-all category that we'll call otherism. Metaphysical naturalism and supernaturalism are symmetrical hypotheses. Naturalism says that the physical ultimately explains why everything exists, including the mental, if the mental exists. Supernaturalism, on the other hand, says that the mental ultimately explains why everything exists, including the physical, if the physical exists. And so that those clauses at the end of those definitions are inserted to account for eliminative materialists and eliminative idealists, respectively. And then you've got otherism. So since they're perfectly symmetrical claims, they are equally modest. And intrinsic probability is determined by 2 and only 2 things, modesty and coherence. They're equally modest and they're equally coherent. So their intrinsic probability is equal. But we also know that both naturalism and supernaturalism could be false, and otherism could be true. So it follows, by simple algebra, that metaphysical naturalism and supernaturalism have prior probabilities that are equal, but have to be less than 1/2 in order to make room for otherism. So not only is the prior probability of naturalism not 1, it's not virtually 1, it's not even 1/2. So I think that's just flat out wrong, and I have no idea how he could justify saying that. The second objection he made was that to the argument for moral agency was that it commits the fallacy of the false dichotomy, because naturalism and supernaturalism are not, or excuse me, he said, maybe it was theism, I don't remember, are not the only 2 hypotheses that you can invoke to explain mental entities like consciousness. And I think he gave examples of sprites and fairies and whatnot. And I think what he missed is the fact that those hypotheses are actually sectarian versions of supernaturalism. So they entail that supernaturalism is true, but supernaturalism does not entail that they are true. So if we assume that naturalism has an intrinsic probability of 40%, supernaturalism has an intrinsic probability of 40%, and otherism has an intrinsic probability of 10%, it follows deductively that spritism and fairyism cannot have an intrinsic probability greater than 40%, and in fact it's probably quite a bit less than that. Out of all the sectarian versions of supernaturalism, arguably theism is the most attractive version of those versions, of those different sectarian versions, and it's certainly much more coherent than fairyism or spritism. Theism, after all, posits one God, not many, and it posits a supernatural being with infinite attributes. And in a certain sense, the infinite aspect of those attributes is simpler than some qualified version of that, because as soon as you say, well, you have 4 bits of knowledge rather than an infinite amount, then you can ask the question, why is it 4 bits of knowledge instead of 5, instead of 5 billion, instead of anything else? Whereas when you're dealing with infinite quantities, there's a certain philosophical elegance that lends itself to greater simplicity.
So
that would be.
if I can,
I'm sorry, someone's trying to get at that. Anyway, that would be one of the reasons why I would say that theism has a much higher intrinsic probability than fairyism and spritism.
Sure. Dan, you wanted to say something?
So, yeah, I was. So, Jeff, you said that theism is more coherent than spritism, but then you went on to explain how it was superior in terms of being a simpler hypothesis, and thereby invoking the explanatory virtue of simplicity, but not coherency. So I was wondering if you could clarify why spritism was more, why theism was more coherent than spritism.
As I understand it from reading the writings of Paul Draper, coherence here does not mean strict, like, deductive coherence where something's, it's not a black and white thing where you're either pregnant or you're not, it's either coherent or not. He talks about degrees of coherence. Yeah. And the trick seems to be that you take a proposition and you break it out into its constituent or subcomponent, if you will, propositions. You, to use terminology from set theory, you partition it into its different elements, and then you can see, and then you measure how well each of those partitions fit together with each of the other ones. So I hope I'm doing this concept justice. So he argues in some detail that if you do this with theism, if you break it out into its sub-propositions, if you will, and then ask how well does the attribute of omnipotence fit together with omniscience, for example, and he says it fits together pretty well. And you can do this for each of these other propositions. Now, compare that to the hypothesis of spritism. First of all, what is the formal definition of spritism? I mean, I'm sort of tossing this around, but I don't actually know what the formal definition of spritism is. Maybe someone could enlighten me on that. But whatever it is, you would then break it out into its component sub-propositions, and you do the same thing. You'd measure its degree of coherence. And the argument is that if you do that, theism is going to come out on top above spritism, above fairyism, above leprechaunism, above Santa Clausism, above flying spaghetti monsterism, or Pastafarianism, I think would be the fancier name for it. It's going to come out above and beyond any of those competitors. And so based on that, I told my debate opponent last night, I said, yeah, you can invent or appeal to, invoke these other rival explanations, but they're ad hoc in a way that theism isn't. And this was another central point of dispute in the debate last night, is the notion that not all supernatural hypotheses are created equal. And in fact, this is the fallacy behind the slogan, I contend that we are all atheists, I just believe in one less God than you do. That completely ignores the fact that not all supernatural hypotheses have equal intrinsic probabilities.
I think that there are good arguments for the incoherency of a theistic God, that or at least is usually as typically posited, but that's a different. But I think where we would agree is that not all supernatural hypotheses are created equally, and that if someone wants to cite something like spritism or leprechaunism, they have to tell us more about what it is that they're even talking about, so that we can start to do something like measuring the coherency of their proposition, if we're going to use Draper's method of analysis.
Yeah, I'm actually curious, if we go back to the argument for moral agency, so a lot of I think a lot of people would object to this argument and say, well, look, I don't accept libertarian free will, right? A lot of atheists are going to say that, a lot of naturalists. Well, couldn't it be, I mean, to kind of maybe put a check mark on this argument, couldn't it be the case that you could interpret this more broadly? Couldn't you just say agents of the type that they are able to kind of metacognate about their actions and how their actions would affect other moral agents? They are capable of empathy in this way. Couldn't you talk? I mean, because that you're not appealing to something so objectionable as libertarian free will, but it seems that you're still getting the moral meat from theism, and so it seems like if you step it a little bit broadly that way, you can avoid that objection. Do you think that would lose any strength of the argument on the other side of the coin there?
Well, I mean, this is kind of you're reminding me of when I defended what I called an F-inductive argument from consciousness for theism. And by the way, to toot my own horn, I emailed Richard Swinburne about this, and he loved my concept of an F-inductive argument. So I can actually claim I have props from Richard Swinburne. So the argument, the F-inductive argument from consciousness to theism, basically says, look, supernaturalism, theism entails supernaturalism. Supernaturalism says that the mental is metaphysically ultimate. The mental ultimately explains why everything else exists.
Right.
And if there is anything physical, it's only because of something mental. In contrast to naturalism, which again says that the physical is ultimate, and the physical ultimately explains why everything exists. And if there is anything mental, it's ultimately explainable in terms of the physical. So based on those symmetric claims, it's almost trivial to construct an argument from mental properties to theism, right? Because on the assumption that supernaturalism is true, on the assumption that theism is true, the probability that there would be mental properties is 1. It follows by definition. On naturalism, the probability of mental properties is less than 1. Some would say it's less than 1/2, but whatever it is, it's definitely not 1. Now, someone may say, and in fact my debate opponent yesterday said, yeah, but there's a difference between the existence of mental properties or consciousness in general versus the existence of human consciousness. And that is absolutely correct. So I'm not claiming that the probability of human consciousness conditional upon theism is 1. The point is that if theism is true, we don't have to invent a completely radically different metaphysical category to account for human consciousness. Because consciousness is a mental substance, whatever that means, or a mental property, and that is the deepest part of reality in a supernatural worldview. Whereas if naturalism is true, consciousness, the so-called hard problem of consciousness, that would be a very odd entity. I'm not claiming it's logically incompatible with naturalism. I don't think that it is. But it would be it's in a completely different metaphysical category. And so even though theism doesn't entail that human consciousness exists, the probability of it existing on theism is much greater than the probability of it existing on naturalism, probably several orders of magnitude greater. And this points to a key misunderstanding about evidence. In order to show that something is evidence, ultimately we're measuring ratios. We're measuring the ratio of the probability of E on H1 to the probability of E on H2. It's all about the ratio. And a lot of people forget this. They think that the way you deal with probability and evidence and inductive arguments is to show that the probability of E on H1 is really, really high, and the probability of E on H2 is really, really low. And if you can do that, that's really great for rhetoric, because then it makes it really easy to illustrate to a lay audience that the evidence is really, really strong. But that isn't required to have evidence. To make up totally fictitious numbers, the probability of E on H1 could be 0.999, and the probability of E on H2 could be 0.99, and E is still evidence favoring H1 over H2.
Right.
Or, to go to the other end of the scale, the probability of E on H1 could be 0.001, and then the probability of E on H2 could be 0.0001, and it would still be evidence favoring H1 over 2 by an entire order of magnitude. So this is a key point that a lot of people miss, and it's especially easy to miss if you don't use sort of the Bayesian formal probabilistic notation to keep track of this. It's about a ratio. Ratios are what we use to measure the strength of evidence.
Interesting. Dan, you got anything to say?
No, I mean, I think I disagree. As I said before, I think the one place where I might disagree with Jeff is about the strength and the coherency of theism. At least, at least it's classically construed. I mean, maybe one can put together something that's sort of a patched-up theism, but I think that there are conceptual issues with for the properties of God as they're usually construed. But at least the way that he's, I would agree with what Jeff has said about evidence, and I also agree with his. I like his the argument that he presented for God's existence. I think that is one of the stronger arguments that I've heard put forward for theism.
Can I jump in by chance? I just
No, Brandon. Stay back.
Why did you invite me? Gosh, no. When I heard the argument laid out, about moral agents, I immediately kind of stuck on the first premise, and it seems to me, I mean, I don't know enough about this, so I'm maybe just speaking ignorantly, but I watched a talk from Dan Dennett, and it seems like the kind of response he would give to premise one is that would be like, well, this only follows if you have a certain conception of what a moral agent is, and if you understand what moral agents really are, given compatibilism and what we know of science, that premise one just, the whole thing doesn't follow from that.
I think Brandon actually has a good point here. I mean, there's a certain kind of, if you accept a certain kind of reductive view, then you might say, well, hold on, what exactly is a mental property? So, for instance, there was once upon a time, there was a period of time in which people didn't realize yet that this wet substance that we call water is composed of H2O molecules. But now that we've realized that, we realize that, in fact, the statement that water is H2O is a tautology, because water just means H2O. But there was a time in which we didn't know that. We didn't know that water is composed of H2O molecules, and at that point in time, you might imagine that there was a group of people who believed that water had certain kinds of supernatural properties or something like this. In the same way that there are people who we call dualists that think that the mind is a non-natural sort of thing.
Sure.
And if that's right, then later on, when we discovered that there's this identity that holds between water and H2O, we learned that, well, actually, arguments that try to cite those kinds of differences are sort of illegitimate because, in fact, it needs to hold across possible worlds that water is H2O, because that's just an identity claim. If it's not H2O, it's not water. Likewise, we might think there is a certain kind of identity claim that will hold between certain kinds of matter that are configured certain kinds of ways, and minds, so that merely stating that there are mental properties wouldn't actually lend more support to theism, because as it turns out, what mental properties are, they're kind of physical property. In that case, citing that there are mental properties, all that would actually lend support to is naturalism, or at least it wouldn't lend any more support to naturalism than theism, because all it would be stating is that there are natural properties of such and such a kind.
Right, right. Which I guess one could. I mean, I suppose one could argue that. Or, go ahead, Brandon.
Oh no, and I was going to say it kind of. I think it went. A little tiny bit further with even just the idea of moral agents, because again, in his talk, which was really good, it's on YouTube. It's talk with Santa Fe about consciousness. I can't remember what it's called, but anyways, he kind of proposed. He didn't lay it out too much, but he proposed what he viewed as a good grounds for morality under this compatibilist view, which is like a contractarian, in which case he says, like in a Hobbesian sense, like literally, like we created good and evil. Like good and evil aren't these like abstract ideas that exist out there, but good and evil are something we created by like social convention, and it has something to do with our promises towards each other in like a contractarian way. And it seems to me that that kind of morality isn't something you would expect under theism, like a morality that is merely about a certain thing that happens when humans come together and form societies. It seems like it has to be something greater than that.
You might expect that under theism. So, I mean, here's a reason to expect under theism. You could say, look, what God did is that God created a universe that had these particular collections of atoms inside of it, and his divine plan was such that when those atoms came together in certain kinds of ways, they would create these human creatures, and it's a natural result of those human creatures interacting with each other that certain kinds of rules are established for the interactions between those creatures.
Right.
So you could even posit that it's you could be a kind of natural law theorist about this, right? Like you could say that, look, there are natural laws about what happens when agents come together in populations, and those natural laws dictate what kinds of obligations they will hold for each other.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was kind of suggesting earlier, is that, you know, if theism predicts moral decision makers, agents capable of entering into a relationship with God, then it seems like that if that's the case, that it would seem to predict either kind of spiritual disembodied entities, or if there is embodied agents, that you would have the that consciousness obviously kind of coming out of particular forms of matter, and that's just the way God brought it about, which would still seem obviously more likely on theism, the fact that there are particular arrangements of matter that interact in this way. That would still seem more likely on theism, obviously, than on naturalism, and so maybe that ratio isn't as strong, but it still seems like that argument is still worth considering, even if we don't assume a kind of libertarian framework.
Yeah, I mean, given this whole line of inquiry that we've been doing, I mean, doesn't it seem kind of, if one holds that theism, like on the whole, is less probable, then anything we consider evidence on its face, because we don't have enough reason to say, no, this actually doesn't count as evidence, shouldn't we just consider such things as yeah, they're evidence now because of our epistemic stance, but in principle, if we knew everything, we would know that they're not in fact evidence because we'd explain them otherwise.
Well, I don't.
So I mean, this whole project of like talking about how premise one might not follow, kind of seems like.
There's a sense in which if we knew everything, if we were actually omniscient, evidence would be sort of. The concept of evidence would be sort of irrelevant. Evidence matters when your information is incomplete. Otherwise, everything just follows deductively or follows because you already knew it.
Yeah, God doesn't make evidential inferences
at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah. If we knew everything, there wouldn't be evidence because that just wouldn't. Yeah, but I mean more that if you're fairly confident based on like say other arguments enough, you should be able to say like with an argument like this that I'll say tentatively that it's evidence, but I also hold that in principle there's most likely an explanation as to why this actually isn't good reason to believe.
I think
how are you justifying that claim?
Skeptical atheism.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of what it would. Yeah.
That's the atheist parallel to skeptical theism. Skeptical theism says God has good reasons for allowing evil that we don't, that are too complicated for humans to understand. And skeptical atheism says that there are good mechanistic explanations for things like consciousness, explanations that we haven't discovered or are in principle undiscoverable because they're too complicated for us to understand.
Or that we shouldn't expect to be able to discover them and so the fact that we don't know about them isn't actually evidence against it. So actually, this is a good transition to talk about skeptical theism. So at least I kind of want to start in the context of like a Rowe-style no-seum inference, right, where you have, particular instances of suffering that are so bad that they don't seem like they have any obvious justification that, that if a God existed, it would have not allowed this thing. So there doesn't seem to be any obvious justification that a God could have it if he did exist, that he would permit it. And so we move from that because there's so many of those kinds of suffering, this extreme degree of suffering, that therefore at least one of them probably is actually gratuitous, is the word used. And so to that degree, that is evidence against theism, and obviously this is a all things considered conclusion. But the popular response from the theist here is to invoke a kind of skeptical theism and say, look, we're not given theism, we're not in a position to say that, or we're not in a position to place probabilities rather on these things, so that because there's such an epistemic chasm that exists.
I'm on a phone call. If you can believe this, on my laptop.
Oh. And lost my train of thought. So the view is, of course, is that we're not allowed to make that inference. The theist says, and this is because we're so mentally deficient compared to God that we shouldn't really expect to be able to understand God's reasons for allowing the things that he does. And so we can't really count this as evidence against God. Now, according to Paul Draper, skeptical theism is successful in rebutting this particular kind of evidential argument from suffering. And that's because, if you're going to say that we're not in a position to place probabilities on those things, and the argument requires that we do that, then of course, then that should be a successful response to that argument. But more Draperian arguments, where you're kind of comparing the explanatory power of theism versus naturalism on a particular set of facts about the world that are known, he argues that that kind of skeptical theism doesn't actually pose much of a problem, and his main reason for this, as I understand it, is that, it is the case, it could be the case, of course, that there are unknown reasons that God might have to allow certain instances of suffering, but of course then it's also the case that there might be additional reasons why God might want to prevent such instances of suffering, or facts about conscious creatures or something to that effect. Now, I'm concerned about this because I'm not entirely sure that that kind of skepticism can be stopped at the at that initial view of skeptical theism. So again, as I said, the initial we'll call it skeptical theism 1, right? That is a successful response to Rowe's argument. This skeptical theism says that because of the evidential gap, or the epistemic gap between God and man, that we can't place probabilities on it, and so we can't even say, all things being equal, it should be evidence for atheism over theism, right? Because they're saying that we can't even say that all things are equal. So to even say that it doesn't matter, because we are not in a position to even make that judgment.
Yeah.
And part of me, I'm concerned that I don't think that that when you compare Draper's explanatory power on these two different hypotheses, on his argument from pain and pleasure, it seems to me like it's not at all obvious how this skeptical theism 1, we'll call it, how that isn't also a successful response to that, because it does make assumptions about what God is likely to do, given its moral nature.
So the answer to that is a principle in probability theory called the theorem of total probability. Draper calls it WAP, the weighted average principle. And if you do a search on my last name, Lowder, and basic structure of my evidential arguments, eventually you'll arrive at a PDF file that gives you, I think it's on page 5. I'm actually trying to find it right now. Let's see, it's page 3. You'll actually, in a section called Evaluating Auxiliary Hypotheses. So if T represents the hypothesis of theism, then A represents the auxiliary hypothesis that God has reasons unknown to humans for allowing evil. And you use the theorem of total probability, or the weighted average principle, to measure the evidential impact of this auxiliary hypothesis. This auxiliary hypothesis basically functions as an expansion of theism. It presupposes that theism is true, but the content of the auxiliary hypothesis goes beyond the content of theism. And the theorem of total probability follows from the Kolmogorov axioms of the probability calculus. It follows deductively. There's absolutely no doubt about the mathematics of it. And basically it asks us to consider a couple of questions. First of all, what is the probability that the auxiliary hypothesis is true on the assumption that theism is true? And secondly, what is the probability that the auxiliary hypothesis is false on the assumption that theism is true? And Draper's point is, in a nutshell, that there's no more reason to assume, on the assumption that theism is true, we have no more reason to assume that the auxiliary hypothesis is true than we do to assume that the auxiliary hypothesis is false. We're literally ignorant, and so there's no justified reason for assuming one or the other. And since that's the case, mathematically, in the formula, they cancel out. And so at the end of the day, we have to make statements about evidence based on what we do know rather than what we don't know. And what we do know are facts about the biological role of pain and pleasure. facts about the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings, facts about virtue and vice, etc. And according to Draper, and I happen to agree with him, those are all facts which are very much more probable on the assumption that naturalism is true than on the assumption that theism is true. And so I happen to agree with Draper that skeptical theism utterly fails against his arguments, and in fact, in a very diplomatically, a very diplomatic way, Draper smacked down another philosopher who tried this on him by the name of Richard Ott at University of California at Santa Cruz, and Draper wrote a rebuttal that just destroyed this sort of argument by applying the weighted average principle. And this is...
You're going to need to send that to me.
What's that?
I said you're going to need to send that to me.
I think I already did.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, reply to Ott, O-T-T-E.
Oh, I don't think I have that one, no.
Oh, I should have. Okay, I can send that to you.
Awesome.
I'm making sure I have it. I guess I should make sure I have something before I promise send it. Yeah, I have it. The file name was Draper, More Pain and Pleasure.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I have. I don't think I have that one. But
okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, Draper completely smacked him down. And that was a long time ago, and there's been no rebuttal, and I don't know how there could be. And other theists have commented saying that they agree that Draper's rebuttal is decisive.
Oh wow. Okay.
So,
well, yeah. I mean, you putting it that way in terms of treating it as an auxiliary, that makes a lot more sense. That's encouraging.
Hold on, what is it that you treat as an auxiliary? Sorry, this is a lot of this is technical.
the auxiliary hypothesis is the hypothesis that God has unknown reasons for allowing facts about evil to obtain. God has unknown reasons for allowing gratuitous suffering. Facts about the amount of pain that we have, the distribution of pain, the nature of pain.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. What are those? So yeah, he's in his form of the problem of evil, which is the just various different facts about pain and suffering, and whether or not they have biological roles, and what are some of the strongest points of that argument? Is it? I know he lists a number of facts, biological facts, and then he has sub-components to those that also weigh in on that issue. What are some of the stronger ones you think? Like, if you were to narrow in on just a few of the evidential aspects of that argument.
Well, he's got four. I mean, really, the problem of evil, aka the argument from evil, it's really a family of arguments.
Right.
And Draper has four arguments that correspond to four categories of evil. One is about the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. The next one would be the biological role of pain and pleasure. The next one would be about triumph and tragedy. And the last one would be about virtue and vice, the self-centeredness and limited altruism of human beings. I would say that facts about virtue and vice are probably the weakest of the four.
Yeah, I was going to think that too.
And flourishing and languishing of sentient beings is probably the strongest, followed by, in fact, I think I read them in, not intentionally, but I think the order I read them off was strongest to weakest. Flourishing and languishing, followed by pain and pleasure, followed by triumph and tragedy, followed by virtue and vice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Other than I might switch the first two, but no, I think you're right in that those last two are the weaker of the four. But yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, flourishing and languishing says there are three facts. Fact number one, only a fraction of living things, including the majority of sentient beings, thrive. In other words, very few living things have an adequate supply of food and water.
Oh, wait, someone...
Yeah.
Who did that?
The random person on the side.
How do I fix it?
I think you can
There we
kick
go.
them yourself.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That was weird. Able to reproduce, able to avoid predators and remain healthy. Fact number 2 is that an even smaller fraction of organisms thrive for most of their lives. And then fact number 3 is that almost no organisms thrive for all of their lives. This is an extremely strong argument for naturalism over theism. I mean, when you consider the fact that the majority of sentient beings that we know about on Earth are not moral agents. They are moral patients. They have characteristics that enable them to be the beneficiary of moral obligations, but they're not subject to moral obligations of their own. So it's clearly not, things like the soul-building theodicy of John Hick. That doesn't apply to them. The free will defense doesn't apply to them. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense on the assumption that theism is true, that such a tiny fraction of living things would, including sentient beings, would thrive. I frankly can't even conceive of a good theistic answer to this argument.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very strong argument.
Yeah, I suppose they could say something like, given theism and evolution, and God had to operate by natural laws, but then you could say, well, he's God. Why would he have to do that at all? That doesn't, he's not constrained by natural laws, whatever. He can create us in the vacuum of space, and everything would be fine.
It's amazing how many theistic answers to these kinds of arguments blatantly presuppose metaphysical naturalism.
Yeah.
Right? Well, but if it wasn't that way, because there's some natural law that it says it has to be that way. Okay, but weren't you the guy just a couple minutes ago defending the fine-tuning argument that said that the laws of physics are not necessary and they're not due to chance, therefore they're due to design? You can't have it both ways, right? If God is omnipotent and can design any physics he wants, any laws, any initial conditions, any constants, you can't then say, but the reason that so many sentient beings languish is because of natural laws. Well, according to you, your God set the whole thing in motion.
Right. He's not, his hands aren't naturalistically tied.
Yeah, when I did this, when I debated Max Andrews at Liberty University, there was this moment during the debate where I asked him, well, why did God create all this other space in the universe? And Max's response was, well, you see, God had to have created all that other stuff in order for the Earth to be here. And it's like, no.
Well, so I was actually, I don't know, I kind of go back and forth on the argument from scale, because, while you could say that
I was using it strictly as rebuttal to the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, so as a particular fact that's surprising on theism, as opposed to the general fact.
It's a rebuttal to the fine-tuning argument in that the universe could be much more finely tuned for human beings, right? I mean, even if you just look at the Earth, theists don't normally say that the Earth was fine-tuned for, all the bazillion species of beetles that we have here, but there are many more species of beetles than there are, there are many more beetles than there are humans, so you might have thought that, just looking at the Earth, that it was sort of fine-tuned for beetles. In fact, there's probably much more shit on the planet than there are people. So you might have thought that in fact, all the higher mammals, as a natural course of things, they all produce shit. So you might have thought that our world was actually fine-tuned for the production of shit. But as was
That's
once
This is a really shitty argument, dude.
So like the in fact it was John Stuart Mill who once said that no one ever infers God's existence from a coprolite. A coprolite being a fossilized piece of poo. But yeah, so the scale argument in this case is just supposed to show that, look, in what sense are you saying that this is actually fine-tuned if it's the case that maybe our universe was fine-tuned for the production of, giant burning balls of hydrogen. And there's really nothing that he can say in response to that, because there's no reason to pick out human beings over and above the existence of stars, especially since our universe is filled with stars and isn't really filled with people.
Yeah, I mean, if you focus on the observation of giant hydrogen balls, that doesn't seem to be predicted by theism any more than it would be predicted on naturalism. But the broader question. Oh, go ahead, Brandon.
Oh no, that was my daughter. Sorry, but no, doesn't theism at least predict minds? So it seems like, maybe one could say something like
kind of theism, right? You have to. So here's two different theistic hypotheses. One kind of theism is the sort of theism that Christians want, which is a theism in which a loving God creates sentient beings who can have a relationship with him. But another kind of theism, another kind of deity that we can imagine, is the kind of shit-loving deity that I imagined before. Who really just wants to create shit-producing machines.
I see. So to even say that it predicts minds is to say you know something already about the nature of the God.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I was wondering. If we weren't staying on that argument anymore, I was wondering about. Do you remember that one that Alex brought up about the given theism, it actually isn't necessarily that even free actions, that bad consequences necessarily follow from them. Remember, I think you brought it up with us that God could create a state where people could still do free actions and choose to harm other people, but no harm would actually come from them.
Yeah, no. Well, so I think certain kinds of harms could be prevented. So, for example, if it's the case, or you often hear the claim that God plays hands off with the murderers, torturers, and rapists of the world because he wants to preserve their free will, because free will is such a good thing, and that moral actions wouldn't be real moral actions without the possibility, of course, of great evil actions. But it doesn't seem to be the case that, I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to be the case that you could preserve the torturer's free will while protecting the victim from some of the psychological problems that might come about through that we know come about through torture, right? Or some of the more physical pain to their person. So you could have, the intent, and then the beginning to bring about that action, but then just preventing them from being able to do that action, so that they still get a moral tick mark on their naughty list, essentially, while protecting the victim from any possible harm. While that moral action is still counted as a negative, so they're still judged. It's just that the action didn't come about. It seems like they're still responsible for their clear intention to do that action. So it doesn't seem, and obviously if God is all-powerful, he could bring about this state of affairs. So that seems to me to undermine at least some of the aspects of a standard free will defense, I guess. But I think that's what you were referring to, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem all that inconsistent with something like Molinism or something, where God, actualized the exact world down to the nitty gritty. He fine tuned everything the way he wanted to actualize a certain state of affairs. I mean, why shouldn't he have done that? Seems like it's not logically incoherent or anything.
No,
I'm
it
not
certainly
sure I
doesn't.
agree with that objection to the free will defense. That seems to deny um, free will. It'd be like free will light or something. You have freedom to make certain choices, but not others. I don't know. That doesn't. I'm not. That's not an objection I would make. The objection I would make is to just bypass that issue altogether and simply ask, why is freedom so valuable
Yeah.
compared to the alternatives? The analogy is made between human parents and human children and a divine parent and with God as our father and us as his children. We wouldn't, observe a 2-year-old with matches and a tank of gasoline and let him set it on fire because we wanted him to have the ability to exercise his freedom. We
Right.
wouldn't let a 9-year-old do that. If we saw an 18-year-old doing that, we wouldn't let them. We would say, forget the free will, that's a horrible choice, and we're going to intervene to stop it.
Yeah.
And that seems right to me, and it also seems right to me that you would allow, just as human parents would allow human children to have increasing degrees of freedom once they've demonstrated they can be trusted with it, that a divine parent would do the same thing. So, maybe the 9-year-old Adolf Hitler had the freedom to burn kittens, and the 15-year-old Adolf Hitler had the freedom to shout racial epithets, but the 25-year-old Adolf Hitler did not get the freedom to, lead the Nazi Party. At some point, you say, no, you've lost your freedom, and that's the whole point of incarcerating criminals, right? We say, yeah, you've proven yourself unworthy of being able to exercise your freedom in significant ways, so we're going to lock you up. And I don't see why it would be any different on the assumption that theism is true.
No, I absolutely agree. So the other one that I was referring to was just kind of toying with the idea that even if it was the case that free will was such a good thing, that you would want to preserve it, that doesn't necessarily entail that you would need to allow the consequences. But I fully agree that this idea Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Oh no, go ahead, Justin.
Oh no, I was just going to finish up by saying I think that the objection that Lowder just articulated is a much stronger and more persuasive, I think.
Yeah,
I mean, why wouldn't a theist just come back and say, look, all sins are equal before God? I mean, that seems like a typical line in at least some Christian theologies, and if they take that line, then there is no difference between Hitler killing thousands of people and any other sin that anyone is capable of committing.
But that seems like... Sorry. I mean, that seems like it violates our just basic intuitions over, what justice is. Some things are...
Well, right, but that would be a reason to think that, that conception of God is wrong. But as long as one posited that hypothesis and didn't rule it out just as being prima facie absurd, then I think as far as a response to the problem of evil, it just sort of seems like that would be, if they added that on to the end of the free will defense, that would be a reason why God wouldn't just incarcerate people who do bad things, because you then have this more general idea that well, all things are bad, and that's why we have this fallen nature and whatever else they'd want to say about that.
I just feel like some people would not feel very comfortable with the consequences of that. It seems like if you take that route, then I mean, when you're saying the words "God is just," you're just uttering a meaningless statement. The concept of just there is so far away from what you actually believe justice is that it's meaningless. It becomes an empty statement, I think.
Well, that would be true, but again, that would be a conceptual issue about God. That would be a reason to rule out the hypothesis of a version of theism of that sort, instead of dealing with the actual question of the relation between free will and the problem of evil.
Yeah, but I think any conception of God is going to be, you have to treat them one at a time. You can't have like a blanket. This defeats all conceptions. So I don't think a lot of theists, at least in America, would want to just get rid of an idea of a just God, in any meaningful sense.
Well, that's right, but it seems to me that that a lot of Christians do want to go along with this idea that they do claim as part of their standard theology that God views all sins as equal. But that's a standard part of their eschatology.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I just think they shouldn't be comfortable saying that, I guess. But yeah,
I think it's an absurd view, and if that's the price you have to pay to defend theism, I think that's a pretty hard pill to swallow.
Well, but am I wrong that that's a standard part of Christian eschatology, that all sins are equal before God?
The thing that I've more heard is something along the lines of I don't know. I hate to bring up great comfort, but something like if you do one thing of a certain category, then you're absolutely that category. Like if you've stolen a cookie once, well, in God's eyes, you're a thief. Well, but not that thievery is the same as murdering, but more that once you're one thing, you're like absolutely that thing.
So the idea is that all things are equally sinful before God. I just don't think that actually can make sense with usual theistic talk. When you have God allowing some evils to ensure some greater goods, there's clearly a gradient of goodness and evil, and they can justify each other. They can justify the permission of each other, it seems. It doesn't seem like there's one flat line of all this category is all good in some equal, equivalent way, and then over here you have all the evils that are all on one plane together, right? There seems to be a gradient, and this is how you can work in different scenarios of possible justifications for allowing certain evils, because there's a greater evil potentially, right? Or there's a great good to attain or avoid in terms of the greater evil. But I guess there's some theists, and I guess that's just a bitter pill to swallow on that sense.
Yeah, so it seems like
I've never heard them bring it up in this context, but it seems to me like a natural response. But I've heard them bring it up in the context of explaining the concept of hell, and I've especially heard it from evangelical apologists, that that all sins are equal before God. But yeah, I think it's related to what Brandon was talking about from Ray Comfort, where this conception that all thievery is thievery, period. But I think that if you were to ask Ray Comfort, do you think that all sin is sin? He'd also say yes to that.
Sure. Yeah. It's all. I'm not denying that they would think all sin is sin. I'm just saying that there's clearly a gradient suggested by their other argumentation.
Yeah, because if God
but that's just
were
to say that they talk and
I
consistently.
want to
right?
acknowledge Alfredo, who's been silently typing comments in the comments bar. He said there are even classifications of evil in Christianism, and I think he's right about that. I think sort of the view that all sins are equally bad is a minority view among Christian theologians and philosophers. I could be wrong about that, but I think Alfredo is correct.
Well, it seems like even one is explicitly stated as worse than the others, right? The whole grieving the Holy Spirit or whatever, at least that one goes up.
Unforgivable sin.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Boom, biblical proof, Dan.
Well, and then if like, if it were the case that they're all equal, then yeah, if God were allowing some evils to prevent others, all that would be arbitrary. There couldn't be actual reasons there. Or it'd have to be a third factor of reasons, which could be like God is trying to tell a really good story and this tells a better story than this, but that seems silly. So, I mean,
that's the position that I took on for fun in my philosophy of religion class. I was like, sell us a giant art project, guys.
So I have a quick question. Whoever it is that has children in the background, what time zone are you in?
I'm in Pacific.
Okay.
And we just, she goes to bed. She'll be 4 on Thursday. She goes to bed around 11 or 12. She's not in school yet, so.
Wow, that's late.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is. It's just what we happen to be used to right now, given Mom's work schedule and all that.
Got it.
Alrighty. I think it's 2 a.m. here, so I'm good to wrap it up if you guys are.
Let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, thanks guys for joining me in this chat. It was really interesting, and I should be able to have this up on. I recorded this on my YouTube channel, but I'll probably want to download it and throw it onto the Reasonable Doubts so that more people will see it. But yeah, so thanks guys for joining me in this interesting discussion.
Absolutely.
See you guys.
Nice.
See you later.